those are the top stories that we're tracking for you at this hour. You're watching Restarting India, and I'm Shereen Bhan. Well, today it is time for us to focus on the manufacturing sector, which has been struggling for traction in a weak economic environment, further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, according to industry, the biggest obstacle for the Indian manufacturing sector continues to be the high cost of doing business. The factors of production, land, logistics, capital and power are several times more expensive in India than our competitors. Without a reduction in the cost of doing business, programs like Make in India, Self-Reliant India and import substitution can only see limited success, is their viewpoint. The sense is that a lot of emphasis has been laid on the ease of doing business while the cost of doing business has remained unattended. So how should policy be looked at for the sector to become an engine of growth for India? Joining me now to take this discussion forward, R.C. Bhargav, the chairman of Maruti Suzuki. Also on the show, Sumant Sinha, the chairman for Renewable Energy Council at CII and the chairman and managing director at ReNew Power. We're also joined by R. Mukundan, the chairman of the Institute of Quality Control at CII. He's also the MD and CEO at Tata Chemicals. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on the program. Mr. Bhargav, let me come to you first, sir. To start with, the manufacturing problems that plague India are not necessarily linked to COVID. They go back well ahead of COVID, and our share of manufacturing to GDP has been stuck at that 15 to 16% for over a decade or so. Now, you are saying that the government needs to do much more in order to address the cost of doing business, not just the ease of doing business. But let's talk about some of the specific measures the government has already taken. For instance, the corporate tax reduction. For instance, measures taken by the RBI to reduce the cost of capital. Do you believe that is enough now to restart private investment?
Shereen, you're absolutely correct that the problems of the manufacturing sector date back not only just last decade, but date back, as far as I'm concerned, 7 decades. Ever since we started the development of industries after independence, we have never got the manufacturing policies in the right manner. And that is why we have never grown industrially and in the manufacturing way. And the COVID has only highlighted some the weaknesses of the manufacturing sector and what has been happening. Now, when we suddenly realize that there is a need for getting Atma Bharat and that there's too much import happening and all that, we have known this forever. It's nothing new. What you said about ease of doing business and reducing cost of doing business, ease of doing business is a subset of the cost of reducing business costs. It's not, it is required, of course, because it is part of the way of reducing the cost of doing business. So we need that, but we need much more. Absolutely. I think there's a lot more which needs to be done if India is going to become really a competitive manufacturing country.
Okay, so let's talk about making India more competitive. And Mr. Mukundan, let me ask you that question now. Specifically, I listed out 2 or 3 things that the government has already done, specifically for the manufacturing sector. And we've now been we put on the table production-linked incentive schemes as well for specific sectors. But from a competitiveness point of view for the manufacturing sector in general, what are the specific pain points that need to be prioritized? Logistics costs, power costs, what is the current disadvantage?
Oh, thank you, Shereen. I think what we did a few years ago was to actually benchmark and taking a sector, because it differs sector to sector, the chemical sector, which is where we play, and we benchmarked what is the disincentive or what is the cost we are incurring in India. And we came to this conclusion: we were incurring 6% higher cost. But the 6% higher cost is not just the way you need to look at 6% is this 6% is going out of the profits the company could earn. So, for example, if my profitability is 12%, I'm losing 6%. So I'm actually at 2/3 the profit what my competitor in, let's say, other parts of Asia would do. And that means I have less capital to flow back, less money to flow back, even to modernize my factories. That's one implication. So don't look at this cost advantage as an issue of just that element, but look at it as a reduction in return on capital, which is a big deal. The issue which we came up with, big factors, at least for chemical industry, where you already have highlighted power cost and logistic cost. when the study was done, on power cost, even the captive power producers had to pay some cess, additional taxes after we have already invested our own capital to produce our own power because the power was not reliable. Now the power is very reliable, but I think we still are a long way off from getting our power cost to be competitive and best benchmarks, and it differs from state to state. Second issue is on logistics. I think on logistics, some things which have happened positively are, for example, we no longer have this whole issue of interstate movement that has been made very smooth. So there is no pileup of inventory at state points, but overall the logistic cost is high. One area where India fails is multimodal transportation, where I think our costs of moving from one mode to another is high. I think that needs to get addressed. Our documentation costs are high. That needs to get addressed. So I think the logistics certainly is one of them. Now, coming back to some of the industries like, let's say, leather industry or textile industry, when we did the study, I think one big factor cause they suffer is because of the labor cost. And I think there the big issue was flexibility of labor, not just the cost alone, also the flexibility of labor. So I think this recent laws which have been passed, the 4 labor codes, I think those are very, very essential to ensure that at least these sectors benefit because they have fluctuating supply and demand situations. So it depends on the sector, and really a lot of documentation has been done, a lot of presentation has been done to government, but really we need to get competitive, as you rightly said, in power, in logistics, and in whole flexibility of labor.
Important points that you mentioned, and that's an important headline number to remember, that 6% higher in terms of costs, and as you pointed out, it impacts the return on capital as well. But Mr. Bhargav, before I get Sumant to comment, I just wanted to address that issue on labour flexibility that Mr. Mukundan raised in light of the legislation that's been passed by both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. I think there is absolutely no quarrel on the fact that India needs to streamline its labour laws. They're far too cumbersome, far too complex, and far too many. And so this is definitely a step in the right direction. The question, though, is that, is there a concern that unions have expressed, the BMS has expressed, workers have expressed, that this gives too much flexibility to the employer, the standing orders being done away with? Will this, in fact, become exploitative against the workers? And what can industry do to allay some of these concerns? But because these are concerns that are often misplaced or often legitimate. What can industry do to allay some of these concerns?
Shereen, you know my views on labor and labor reform. I believe that the policies which have been advocated many times by industry of hire and fire and having flexibility of getting rid of labor and adding labor and using contract labor, I don't agree with that at all. I believe that the maximum productivity and the lowest cost of labor can be obtained if only management talks to the workers, keeps communicating with them, educates them, and makes them actual partners in the industry. If the management makes labor believe that actually the growth of the industry, the prosperity of the industry will in the longer term be of much greater benefit to the workers than all these union negotiations and government laws and things, I think the cost comes down. And you look at the cost which we have had in Maruti of labor, the kind of productivity we have had. We have done it under the older labor laws, not even what has been modified. And we have by far the highest productivity of labor, I think, than I would say any manufacturing industry in India. And the labor laws have never come in the way. In fact, I think this movement towards more of hire and fire is not in the right direction.
Okay. You're saying that this move towards hire and fire is not in the right direction, and that's the word in from R.C. Bhargav. He's a veteran of Indian manufacturing, so he knows what he's talking about. The safeguards need to be in place, and they have, of course, shown how productivity can be improved even within the existing code, but that might be a specific instance of Maruti Suzuki. But let me get Sumant Sinha into the conversation. Sumant, let's now talk about what can be done? And, again, I go back to the fact that there has been so many committees that have put recommendations on paper. The most recent in 2019, the Surjit Bhalla Committee, which had once again recommended what needs to be done to boost India's exports and to boost India's manufacturing. Now, given the current situation, given the fiscal constraints, what do you believe is realistic? I mean, we talked about power costs, for instance. Given the situation of the power sector, Sumant, do you really believe that we're going to see any significant decrease in power costs?
So, Shereen, look, I think that a lot of things can actually be done which don't have to dip into the government's fiscal deficit issue and make that worse. Number one, of course, is the issue of interest rates, which you talked about earlier. Our sector, as you know, is a capital-intensive sector. We suffer the tyranny of high interest rates like almost nobody else does. I find that for us, at least, despite all the interest rate reductions by the RBI, rates are exactly where they were a couple of years ago. We're still paying 10, 10.5%, 11% or thereabouts. So we have to find some way of actually having the rates coming down. That has just not happened so far. And that is something, high interest rates is something that impacts every single person, every single corporate across India. It dampens investor demand, consumer demand, and so on. So I think that is something that the government has to find a way of addressing. It's not been addressed so far. The second issue is the issue of liquidity. Today, we all know that banks are still not lending. Credit costs, the credit premium that they're charging is still very high. But over and above that, they become very risk averse. So there's just not enough liquidity in the system. And because of lack of liquidity, that also depresses investment plans and, again, consumer demand. So I think that's another area that has to be addressed. Now, that can be done by the government or the RBI asking banks to be a little bit more forthcoming on the lending side and perhaps, reducing the CRR ratios and so on even more aggressively, or reducing the repo rates more aggressively. So I think something has to give there to really address that problem. So that is number one. The second issue you talked about is...
Sumant, I'm sorry I'm interrupting you. Because, again, we often hear this argument about the Reserve Bank needs to do more and we need to see the cost of capital reducing. But, today we're at a record low of 4% when it comes to repo. There's been a 250 basis point cut since 2019, 115 basis point cut since 2020. Bank loans, housing loans have seen 104 basis point cut. Vehicle loans have seen 102 basis point cut. So we have seen interest rates come down, but we haven't really seen any pickup necessarily in private demand. So is this correlation between investment and interest rate reduction overdone?
No, I think on the consumer side, of course, consumer demand depends not just on interest rates, but a bunch of other factors as well. But certainly on the investment side, on the corporate side, that same reduction in interest rates has not yet been passed on to corporates. And so therefore, the amount that we have to pay to borrow is still fairly high. And this is the point, that the numbers that you quoted are exactly the problem, that despite reductions in the RBI's repo rate, we have not seen a reduction in banks' credit risk premiums. So repo rates have come down, credit risk premiums have gone up, and so therefore the absolute interest rates have kind of remained the same. And so therefore that's not really helped very much. The second thing is, the question one can ask is, why should repo rates in fact even be at 4% right now? The economy shrank at 23% in the last quarter, has been declining growth for the last 6 quarters before that. Why should you have repo rates of even 4% at this point? I mean, most of the Western world has in fact reduced their central bank rates almost to zero or negative in certain cases. So, you can actually look at that and wonder, in fact, if those rates are right. And I understand that on the other hand, you have savers and you have to protect those guys, those people as well. But we have to find some way of reducing the credit risk premium at the very least and get banks to start lending more to corporate India. Right? So then that is one issue. The second issue you talked about is the power sector and how to reduce rates. Now, again, nobody has to cut rates. I think there are 2 things that can happen. Number one, DISCOMs can improve their efficiency dramatically by trying to reduce their AT&C losses, which still accounts at an aggregate level to 20%. If that gets reduced to 10%, then in that case, your tariffs can come down by almost 50 paise or about 10%. So that is one. The second thing is, now today technologies exist for corporate India to actually not buy power from the grid and buy power directly from suppliers, whether it's renewable energy or thermal, etc., through the open access market. and actually bring down their costs. So I would actually urge corporate India to look at solutions based on some of these issues. And I'm not putting in a plug for renewable energy here, but the reality is that renewable energy solutions have become cheaper. And so therefore, I would encourage corporates to look at that, because there is a way for you to bring your cost of power down. And when that starts happening, it's going to put pressure on discoms, who will then also have to start reducing their rates that they charge to commercial customers and industrial customers. And hopefully that then gets us into a virtuous circle. So there are things that we can do to address it.
Nicely done, Sumant. Nicely done. Very subtle, Sumant, very subtle plug. But let me get Mr. Mukundan and Mr. Bhargav back into the conversation. And Mr. Mukundan, let's talk about this export aspiration. The Prime Minister has spoken of, and of course, we've had this aspiration for a while now. I'm just taking a look at some of the data. And once again, this is data that's been put together by that HLAG headed by Surjit Bhalla. If you take a look at export compliance, cross-border trade cost, 52 hours when it comes to India versus 2 hours for the US. Import compliance, 64 hours for India versus 2 hours for the US. So while a lot has been made about the ease of doing business and we've moved up the World Bank's rankings and so on and so forth, clearly this continues to be a pain point from a cost point of view, not just an ease point of view.
Yes, Srini, I think you highlight a very important issue. The issue is not just of looking at specific costs in terms of rupees, but also using time as a value, time as an element of cost. And I think we forget many times inventory sitting idle at some point, waiting for clearances, waiting for movement, I think is money lost in the process. And this is not just the case. We've also had ships not turning up in Indian ports because it takes too long, because that then reduces the supply of ships into India. That also reduces the amount of flexibility you have in moving material out. So we need to get ourselves more efficient. I think the whole issue of element of how do we get more efficient, how do you use the new technologies, how do you digitize, how do you make these processes trust-based rather than based on compliance and distrust, that you have to prove that you're right, but you start with the assumption that you're right, and then once in a while do checking just to check whether people are doing right or not. I think we need to move a long way. This government has laid the foundation to move in that right direction. I think we now have an opportunity to actually build on what the various changes which have been done in the last few years, to build on that and build a world-class export hub out of India. But this export hub, again, I think is not going to come across all the commodities. We need to choose products and commodities where we want to win, and we need to put disproportionate effort in those areas and engage very smartly. And also we need to engage in the overseas markets.
So let me ask you, Mr. Mukundan, I'm interrupting you because, you're right when you say that the government needs to disproportionately try and push some sectors. It doesn't have the wherewithal or the coffers to, push every single export, but identify the strengths and then push some of those sectors. It's identified, for instance, pharma, API, medical devices, specialty chemicals. Let me ask you, Mr. Mukundan, on the back of what you've seen with the PLI, does it really position India as an export behemoth, as an export hub? Because that's not the feedback that one has got.
Actually, one of the things I just want to say is that if you look at pharmaceutical or specialty chemicals, we know very clearly that India has export, let's say, competitiveness, which can lead to large export orders. Second thing, this sector can certainly benefit in the current context. You've got to look at it in the current contextual framework. That world is looking for 1+1 supply base. Once the world is looking for 1+1 supply base, many of these APIs and many of these intermediates, the supplier of choice, China has by far 90-95% share of the supply base. And that supply base is to shift out. And if we can play a role, if we can capture part of that, I think it brings in very quickly that we become part of a supply chain and we can build scale in those sectors, which is why I think this PLI scheme comes in. It has got to be very time bound. It is very contextual in the current situation where world is shifting to resilience. And that shift to resilience is going to last maybe for 10 years. But if we can work in these next 10 years to plug ourselves into the world supply chains, I think we will benefit exceedingly well. So this is a very strategic move. This is a very timely move in that context.
Okay. Okay, so strategic and timely move. Mr. Bhargav, you spoke about how you believe that labor and that labor law inflexibility has been overplayed as a challenge or a constraint. Let me ask you about the other L, and that is land. Because once again, if I look at the long list of demands that industry always puts forth to government in terms of reforms, land is right up there as well. Now, do you believe that land continues to be a big constraint when it comes to manufacturing projects?
Shereen, actually, the total cost of manufacturing in India goes up for a large number of reasons. Land is only one of them, and there is a problem in getting land because it takes too long. And as Mr. Mukundan says, the cost of time is never factored into the cost of manufacturing. And there is a delay in almost everything which is related to an interface of industry with government. Wherever government agencies are involved, and I'm talking of all the agencies in the field, in the states, everywhere, delays take place, those delays cost. There are other reasons which you should also recognize, which we never talk about. For example, we are talking of the banks and the lending cost. Do we realize that banks are not profitable in India? And if they're not lowering interest rates, it's because that would further deteriorate their balance sheets. And this is happening because partly they're required to subsidize a certain part of their loaning activities, the priority sector loans and things. Partly they run into large NPIs because historically there has been a great deal of interference in the lending process. So public sector banks themselves, by definition, are a major cost of the high cost of capital in India. As long as this public sector banks exist and they're used as a means of promoting socialism, you will get a high cost of things. You have to do it separately.
Yeah.
Shereen, you take compliance
you have to do it separately.
I don't think any country has as many compliances as the industry has today. It all costs. You take the inputs which you buy from different industries.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Sumant Sinha, in exactly a minute, the top 3 things that you believe need to be done, given what Mr. Mukundan said, the time is now, we need to be strategic, we need to be opportunistic. What is it that you believe needs to be done?
Well, I think the government is already doing a number of things. I think we have to identify some key sectors where India has good comparative advantage and really push manufacturing clusters in those areas, give whatever production-linked incentives that make sense for that industry to thrive. And we have to find ways in which our manufacturing industry can become part of global supply chains, because those are all very sticky activities. Once we do become part of global supply chains, then that advantage will stay with us for a long period of time. And we have to somehow basically prove that Indian manufacturing globally, we have to prove that Indian manufacturing can be competitive, that despite all the costs that we talked about right now, and one of the things we didn't talk about was the cost of the legal system, which also can sometimes, cause delays and tardiness. How all of this, despite all of that, India still offers advantages on manufacturing costs that make us a very viable alternative to China. And therefore, we must enter conversations as a alternative to China. And I think that is the area that the government is already working on. But the identification of which those clusters are and what incentives to give has to be done rapidly, and then we have to move fast.
Yes. Well, we've already seen some schemes being announced for particular sectors under the PLI plan, but let's see how many more get added on. We're given to understand maybe 8 other sectors could be included. Well, R.C. Bhargav, R. Mukundan, Sumant Sinha, many thanks for joining us here on the India Inc. Roundtable on Restarting India, as we talk about not just the ease of doing business, but the cost of doing business and what the government can do to bring that down further, of course, in partnership with industry. We'll take a break. There's a lot more coming up. Don't go anywhere. We're back in a moment.